Good evening, everybody. I'm Richard Hodges, the Williams Director, and it's a pleasure to introduce you to the Douglas C. Lovell Report from the Field, an annual lecture that's given in memory of Doug Lovell, who was and served as a distinguished member of the museum's board some years ago. And I'm pleased to say that his wife, Elida, is here tonight with us. So it's a special pleasure. It's a special pleasure also that this lecture on this occasion is part of our Year of Evolution, a series of lectures in advance of the year associated with Charles Darwin's birth and the anniversary of Origin of the Species, coinciding with our exhibition Surviving. And coinciding with Surviving, up in Surviving you will see many different stone tools, most of them replicas, but undoubtedly made under the tutelage of tonight's speaker, Harold Dibble, who's our curator of the European section. I suspect many of you know who Harold is. He's been at Penn since 1982 when he came here from the University of Arizona. His thesis was on stone tools, the technological study of stone tool production at a cave tabun in Israel, which was finished in 1981. Since then, he's been prodigiously active in many different countries and publishing widely, including books on the Upper Pleistocene prehistory in 1988, the Middle Paleolithic adaptation, behavior, and variability in 1992, the Paleolithic prehistory of the Zagros Taurus in 1993, a handbook of Paleolithic typology in 1994, and so it goes on and on until more recently using computers and archaeology, which was published 6 years ago. Apart from his many excavations in Egypt, in Morocco, in the Middle East, and in particular in France, he's also been visiting professor at the University of Bordeaux. He's undoubtedly one of the stars of anthropology here, and tonight he's given us the provocative title, Did Neanderthals Bury Their Dead? Harold.
Thank you. And thank you, Richard. I got to figure out how to get my slideshow up here. I saw that thing from Brian come up and it scared me. I refused to give Brian's talk. I could probably do it better than him, but you know. Okay, well, no, thanks for showing up tonight. It's a great crowd in spite of the weather. Yeah, it's a kind of a provocative title, and you're going to be mad at me because I'm not going to really come down one way or the other, I suppose. But we'll see. I got some new evidence from one of the sites I'm working at, Roc de Marsal, and it speaks directly to this question. And that's what I'm going to go over with you. In fact, you're seeing it before it's published. We've got the article. We've been working on the article since the summer, and we'll be sending it off pretty shortly. But I was hoping, actually, that it would have been out, because you're not really supposed to scoop the journals. But anyway, that's my optimism on all this stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just provide some context about Neanderthals and so forth, provide some context about the question of burials and what we have to look for. Then I'll get into the Roc de Marsal data and go through that with you. Does that sound fair enough? All right. So let's get started then. And just real quick, where we are with Neanderthals, going through the first hominids, the first tools, stone tools starting about 2.5 million years ago or so, through a form called Homo erectus with many variants and whatnot. We get up to Neanderthals about 250,000 years ago, up to, I have here 35,000 years ago. Another article that from one of the sites we just finished is just under review. We actually got dates going back up here at about 30,000, which is the latest dates for Neanderthal in Europe. So that's really exciting because it suggests that Neanderthals really did coexist with moderns for some time in Europe. Then we have moderns starting up in Africa about 110, lasting up, well, modern Homo sapiens actually continues to this day, okay? So rest assured, I'm including you in that group. So that's sort of the time. Here's the space part of it. We have Neanderthals in green that occupied most of Europe, all the way as far east as Uzbekistan. In fact, I'm going to talk about that site very briefly today. And what's interesting is we have moderns in Africa along the coast there. There's one spot that's very complicated because it's sort of where they met, right? And so things are very complicated there. And it's one reason why I'm going to say a lot of my Neanderthal talk is going to be on these guys here, which represent the Europeans, and not on that. Some of that evidence actually contradicts what I'm going to say. But it's a very difficult part because you've got this mixture going on. So how to make sense of it is very difficult. At the same time, just to let you know, I know something about the subject because here's where I've worked. So I've got mostly, and I put this up there because I'm really still trying to figure out, am I Neanderthal or modern Homo sapiens? So I started out here with Neanderthal stuff and quite more recently said, wait a minute, I want to be part of the Homo sapiens down here. So I started working there. But what's interesting, just as a quick aside, why I'm doing this is because we're leading up to a big project, hopefully, of really a direct comparison between the same age material between what's happening with modern Homo sapiens on this side and what's happening with Neanderthals up there. So I've been trying to work up for a few years that ability to make those comparisons. Here's what we got with Neanderthals. Here's kind of what they look like. They've got a bunch of funny features. The brow ridge is like this, wide noses, a very small mastoid process. I don't have it on this slide, but a very small chin. One thing I don't have listed here is they've got big brains. They've got brains as big as ours, okay? So just a little funny traits. No one really knows what those traits mean, what big brow ridges mean, what lack of chin means, or anything else. And that leads to all sorts of debates, okay? Because it's just slightly different. So I'm going to run you through some of the debates that happen about Neanderthals. The first one of the most important, is how do you spell it, okay? You listen to me saying Neanderthal, and I'm sure a lot of you know it as Neanderthal. And really the difference means absolutely nothing. The first one was found in the Neander Valley, and the German in Germany, and the German word for valley was Thal, and then the Germans changed their orthography so it became Tal, and so some people like me started calling Neanderthals, just to be in vogue, right? But it means nothing more than that, so you don't have to worry about it. So that debate is not so bad. The next one is a little touchier, okay? And that's what is their biological relationship to us, meaning, are they a different subspecies that is a sort of a racial variant of modern Homo sapiens, or are they their own species? Notice this has the H because we have to keep it because that's how it was originally spelled when they're first defined. And this problem, I mean, still people talk about a lot. You basically, back in the old days, had a reconstruction, a very famous reconstruction by a man named Boole, taking one of the Neanderthals known at the time, a fellow from a site called Chapelle-aux-Saints, I'll talk about that a little bit, and sort of reconstructed him as being this sort of hunched over individual who could barely walk, you know, and just nothing really like us at all when you compare him to a nice modern, you know, standing tall and like this. But the trouble is, the individual that he used is this one. You notice the lack of teeth, okay? This guy was old, and he was just covered with arthritis. And there's no question he walked around like this. And there's no question that he was probably a horrible person to be around all the time. But he didn't really represent how Neanderthals were, okay? So after a few more, it became quite clear that postcranially anyway, you know, this part down, a little more robust. I'm sort of part Neanderthal myself, okay? And then we've got these funny facial differences, the lack of chin, big smile though, but they're just all sorts of funny things. And this is what's caused all the problem. You know, these are minor differences. These are not major things you can look at. So it's always the question is, well, what's the significance of that, right? Are they a different species or not? Probably the evidence that's giving us the answer is DNA, okay? And there's people from Germany especially who are working on the DNA evidence, trying to map out the entire Neanderthal genome. And what they're discovering when they compare it to moderns is that the Neanderthals were quite distinct. These are all Neanderthals up here as being something different. Still, how many DNA differences does it take to be a different species? That's a big question, right? So we don't know. But I think more and more people are looking at them as being different species. Then, whether or not they're different species, you've got the question of, are they our direct ancestors, or do they represent some sort of extinct side branch? Okay? We know they probably developed from Homo erectus at some time, but did they later develop into us? That's the question. And the two lines of debate about this is basically these. You've got the continuity argument that says once early forms of hominids left Africa about 1.5 million years ago or so, 1.5, they populated a lot of the old world and then just continued to evolve, right, in tandem, different parts of the world, and Neanderthals would be one of these, leading up to Homo sapiens. Okay, that's the continuity argument. The other one is the replacement model, which says, well, you had Homo erectus or some other Homo erectus-like leave Africa, and then maybe made a few other waves into Europe, leading to Homo neanderthals. And then you have a separate origin for modern Homo sapiens, and genetic evidence and other evidence points to Africa. Then they came along and spread throughout the old world, right? Replacing populations such as Neanderthals that were already there. So that's really the question. As I say, increasingly and mostly because of genetic evidence, it looks like the replacement model is the one. That moderns did originate somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa and then spread out and in a sense colonized very recently the rest of the old world. It looks like moderns entered Europe about as early as 40,000 years ago. And like I said, if our dates that we've got from another site, Pesher, are correct, they were with Neanderthals for 10,000 years or so. So that's quite a bit of overlap. So, and that's the reason why I did my Egypt work, in fact, I was looking for footprints, you know, as they walked out. Don't believe everything I say, come on. So, and that also explains that problem with the, as I said, the admixture, right? It probably Neanderthals were in this area here. At some point, moderns come up, and there seems to be something funny going on there. We don't know if there's hybridization or not. That would take away the different species argument if so, but nonetheless, it makes it very complicated. So then the next question is, how modern was their behavior? Okay? And that's, to me, that's a $64,000 question. So you ask things like, well, did they have language? Did they use symbols? We use symbols everywhere, right? And all peoples do across the globe. And of course, our topic tonight, did they bury their dead or engage in other sorts of religious rituals or activity? Okay? And that is what people are looking for an awful lot. But it polarizes everybody. And you got this pendulum that's been swinging ever since the first Neanderthal was found, basically, back and forth, where you've got the dumb Neanderthal people, well, the scholars who think Neanderthals were dumb. No, actually, that worked either way. You could take that. But anyway, and they'll say things like, well, yeah, they're different species, different, you know, no language, no religion, and stuff like that. And they tend to portray their Neanderthals as a sort of brutish, you know, almost subhuman form. And then you've got the smart Neanderthals, right? The group that argues, no, they're the same species, essentially modern behavior, language, and da-da-da-da. And so when they portrayed Neanderthals, it would be in, you know, groups that we would recognize, and they're doing all the things that we recognize as modern peoples do, okay? So that's that debate. And like I said, the modern behavior one is an important one. And there's really two approaches, and I've got to make this distinction because people look at fossils as giving you all the answers that you need. At least the physical anthropologists think so. That if you study the fossils, you're going to learn it all, and really you can't. You can look at fossils and you can try to get ideas about some aspects of adaptation, some very minor aspects of behavior, but really, if you want to understand behavior and what they're doing in the past, you've got to go with archaeology, right? That's going to be the direct reflections of what they're doing, what they did in the past. So when we turn to archaeology, we're looking at things like stone tools. Here's from one of my sites. This is the way a Neanderthal site looks. It's basically their garbage, right? We've got the stone tools here, littered all over the place. Animal bone, animal bone, animal bone, animal bone. Just stuff strewn out all over the place, right? And it's on the basis of that garbage that we try to figure out what's going on, okay, with their behavior. Some stuff, and not the stuff I'm going to really talk about tonight so much, does make use of that kind of evidence. Of course, with burials, we're looking at really a different kind of evidence altogether that you're not going to get from the stone tools necessarily. Now, why is burial an important question? Well, to me, it is important because if it demonstrates, that burial evidence can demonstrate ritualistic or symbolic behavior, right? It can demonstrate that they had religion, that they had rituals, that they used symbols, and so forth. So that's why a lot of people focus on burials. But there's a lot of caveats, too. And we got to go over this just a little bit. The keep in mind caveats, basically, not all humans bury their dead, right? And that means that if we find that Neanderthals don't bury their dead, it doesn't mean they didn't have modern behavior, because any modern group who doesn't bury their dead, you'd have to say the same thing about them. You understand what I'm saying a little bit there? So it's a one-way street. Negative evidence doesn't really say much about the behavior of Neanderthals. They could have been treating their dead any number of ways. Second thing to keep in mind is that it's quite clear, chimpanzees, gorillas, and claims have been made for several animals that they do recognize death, right? And when individuals die, they react to it. For example, I hate to put all this text up here, and I'm not going to read it to you, but basically there's plenty of reports that when an individual dies, the other chimps will recognize it, treat the body deferentially, right? When an infant dies, the mother will sometimes carry it around for a few days even, not as a living baby, not trying to keep it alive, but almost like a package, right? She knows it's dead, but at the same time, of course, she doesn't want to let go, right? So in a sense, there's an emotional tie that's there. The one that you see the picture of is actually a gorilla from the Munich Zoo that expressed the same sort of behavior when her infant died, okay? So there's lots of anecdotal, anyway, evidence to say that chimps and gorillas, our closest primate relatives, do recognize death. And I would be surprised, therefore, if Neanderthals didn't recognize death, right? I'd be very surprised if Neanderthals didn't form friendships, didn't have relationships between mother's offspring or maybe even parents and offspring, right? And so when one dies, you treat them deferentially. But that in itself doesn't mean symbol use, right? It doesn't mean ritual. It means affection. And so that's something very different. So we get then to the problem. Well, let me go back to that. So in a sense, when we're looking at burial evidence, we got to be careful, right? Just the fact that we don't have any, if that comes out to be the answer with Neanderthals, doesn't mean they're not modern. It means they didn't bury their dead. If they did do something special with the bodies, it may not be that it was ritual, right? And it may not be that it's symbolic. So there are our problems, our traps that we got to avoid in trying to figure this stuff out. Am I going too fast for you guys? Is it all okay? Okay. So for archaeologists then, what are the criteria that we use to recognize a burial? And really, I should really start to say funeral a little bit, right? Because there's a difference in a burial. Things can get buried all sorts of ways. What we really want to talk about is a funeral. But so something deliberate, right? Well, the first thing all of you guys are going to say right away is, how about a pit, right? Or a structure, something that if you just find a body lying somewhere, like Iceman, Ötzi, right? You've all heard of him. Well, he's just lying on the ground in a glacier. Well, that doesn't constitute a burial. You need a pit structure, something that contains the body. Sound good? The other thing you need is something out of the ordinary. This has got to give it religious or symbolic significance, something ritual about it, right? Again, just finding a body isn't enough. Here's a good example. This site here, Teshiktash, which is from Uzbekistan, very famous, discovered a long time ago, and used as one of the prime examples of Neanderthal burying their dead with ritual. Because this is an artist's reconstruction here. Here's what it looked like on the ground. Because they found surrounding the body these horn cores of goat, okay, forming a circle around the body and placed there. Well, that sounds pretty extraordinary. It sounds out of the ordinary, right? Surrounding a body with goat horn cores. Here's what it looks like on the ground. Here's a horn core, and here's another one. Here's the body. Okay, it's not quite with the horn cores, but we'll close one eye and say, okay, that's pretty good, until you realize, when you read the report, there were found at the site 768 identifiable animal bones. 760 were goat, okay, including lots of other horn cores. So that means that having an association between goat and the body means nothing, because there's more goat over here, there's more goat over here, there's goat all over the place, right? That's what I mean about not being extraordinary. I'll give you another example. One of the sites I'll talk about later, too, La Pharisee. They found, in association with an infant, 3 beautiful scrapers. Here are 2 of them right there. And I love it because the author says, oh, these were magnificent scrapers offered as grave goods, right? Of course, you guys look at this, and you're saying, it looks like a broken rock, which it is. And in fact, it's the same stuff they used all the time. I think that we interpret it as beautiful offerings, but it's the same stuff found in the same level all over the site. So to take these as being special is really tough. I'll try to hammer this home. We find a body, we come in, and there's a body on South Street, okay, just under the arches of Franklin Field. And they come in and they say, oh my God, we've got a ritual killing. What makes you say it's a ritual killing? Well, because you got the body, you got empty crack vials, condom wrappers, and some squashed soda cans. Well, hello, that sounds like South Street, right? Now if you go out there on South Street and he's surrounded by goat horn cores, I'm gonna say, okay, that's a ritual killing. But finding this stuff in association with the body, the same stuff that you're surrounded with anyway, doesn't make it extraordinary. Okay, that's the problem that we face in this. And when people have done reviews of what's known about the grave goods of Middle Paleolithic burials anyway, Middle Paleolithic meaning Neanderthal, Upper Paleolithic moderns, we find stone tools, we find animal bones, we find rocks that are brought in, like pieces of quartzite or something used as hammerstones. We find no shells, we find no ochre, we find no art or decoration, nothing that stands out. Compare that with Upper Paleolithic burials, right, where you've got plenty of that stuff in beads and stuff in a direct association with the burial. So we have to be careful there. To me, the stuff that's in association is just as important as anything else. So something out of the ordinary, and then we get to the third one. This one I hate. Okay, people use this all the time. I get in arguments with people all the time, and they'll say, well, if the skeleton's articulated, that when we find it, then that means that it must have been buried so that nothing bothered it, right? It was preserved intact. And the only way you get that is with somebody lovingly, ritually, symbolically burying the body, okay? Well, 2 problems. Don't forget, I just talked about chimp affection. And maybe they're covering up Uncle George just because they don't want to look at him decaying. But even more, this is the part that every time I get in this argument, I say, hello, folks, what about dinosaurs? We find dinosaurs articulated all the time, and we don't get people writing in journals, dinosaur burials at, 75 million BC, right? No. I mean, it depends on the conditions. Bodies can get covered. Bodies can be protected for lots of reasons, right? It doesn't necessarily, in and of itself, mean that there was a purposeful interment, okay? So that's sort of the background of what we've got to look for in this stuff. Now what I want to do is turn attention to France, where we've got a lot of evidence for burials. Well, not that much, I guess. We got some evidence. We got the most evidence there is in Europe, okay? And all of that evidence that we have comes, look at this little square here, just in my neck of the woods, all right? And I'm going to talk about a few of these sites. They're all real close to each other. Régordu, Le Moustier, La Pharisee, Roc de Marsal, La Chapelle-aux-Saints, and show you what the evidence is of the burials that we have there first. This is the first one discovered, La Chapelle-aux-Saints. He's the same one that I mentioned that Boule's reconstruction. This one looked good. This is what we got, 1908, folks, right? So the documentation is not great, but we got a sketch. And supposedly it was found in a pit dug into bedrock, okay? Now, bedrock, what do you think about when you hear the word bedrock? Do you think of something soft like sand? Hard. These guys must have been determined to dig a pit in the bedrock. That to me says, whew, you can't get away from the intentionality there. And so, yeah, that's a good candidate. We've got La Pharisee. I just talked about it just a second ago. That's probably the most extraordinary one because we've got something like 6 individuals spread out over the site. But there are things that bother me about it. Again, it goes back to 1909 or so. Here's one of the first ones coming out. They talk about a pit, but I don't see a pit. And I don't like seeing picks. When you're trying to discern if there's a pit there and you're picking the thing out, right? That bothers me. So I'm not really sure what the status is. Also at the site, this is the one my favorite, you've got this curious arrangement of little piles of dirt. And these have been reproduced many times in museum because that looks pretty symbolic too, right? That looks neat. Piles of dirt arranged in some sort of pattern. But folks, how do you find piles of dirt when you're digging in dirt? I've got a fundamental problem with this, okay? Now, I know that I've gone to the beach sometimes, and I've seen people carefully uncover castles and stuff in the sand that I would have never thought had been there before, but somehow they're able to find them, But, mounds of dirt in dirt just strike me as being difficult to do. So maybe we've lost some technique as archaeologists over the past few years. I worry about it. Anyway, let's grant it, okay? Régordu, another one of my favorites. This site's, you ever heard of Lascaux, the famous painted cave? This is like 50 meters down. And dug by an amateur. In fact, there's the guy right there. He owns the farm. And Lascaux became famous. He wants to find another Lascaux, so he starts digging this huge pit in the ground, and lo and behold, finds a skeleton, right? He also finds some bear bones in another part, and so he decided this was an ancient cult of cave bear, even though it was a brown bear. But it was an ancient cult of cave bear, and so one day he decides to attract tourists, so he puts bears in this pit, so the tourists can come and look at the bears. And then the bears started crawling out and attacking everybody who was visiting Lascaux. So he had to close down that operation for a while. But anyway, the skeleton's real. But as far as the burial is concerned, what's really quite clear is that this was a cave that caved in, right? And the voids that contained the cave bear and the skeleton and so forth were just simply places where the rocks fell down and left openings, as rocks will do when they fall. But there was nothing else deliberate about the circumstances. And then we get to Roc de Marsal, which was discovered in 1961, also by an amateur, a guy named John Lafille, who was a school teacher in a village not far away. Got a nice skeleton of a child, 2 to 3 years old, lying on its stomach, actually, and his arms out like this, and his feet bent behind him. But there was clear evidence that it was in a pit, okay? And so what they did was they took the whole thing after it was initially discovered, just took a block of the whole sediment, right, and took it back to the lab for excavation. But it was a fantastic find. We've got it's the most complete Neanderthal child ever found. Okay, and so again you get back to this anatomical connection sort of thing, that it was in good condition, which is a point to be made, in a pit. We found his baby pictures there too, and so we know sort of what he looks like. So this was really something, okay? And Roc de Marsal, to this day, is considered to be one of the leading examples of Neanderthal burials. One, just to show you some of the troubles we have with some of the sites, Le Moustier also furnished a burial that some people still consider to be a burial, but it has the problems that so many of these things have. It was excavated by this guy, Otto Hauser, who is a Swiss German who used to loot everything from France. And he found the skeleton there all right, but it turns out that every time a rich donor would show up, he'd find the same skeleton. And so what would happen, he'd be sitting around talking to the donor, and they'll be exchanging pleasantries. How is it going, Professor Hauser? Are you finding your work going well? Yes, it's going well. We need more money, however, but da-da-da-da-da. Suddenly a workman will run up and say, Professor Hauser, we've just discovered a Neanderthal burial. And everybody goes over and looks at it. The donor's saying, okay, how much do you need, and da-da-da-da-da. The donor leaves. Hauser says, rebury it till the next one shows up. Okay? And he did this 6 or 7 times, literally. So whether that thing came from a pit or whatever, I have no idea. Okay? So it's just like, who knows, whether that was a burial or not. It's hard to say. So there really get back to really 4 examples that most people would agree are burials in France. Okay? 2 were discovered at the very beginning of the last century, folks. Doesn't that hurt some of you? I realized that it was a few years back, and I said, I was born in the middle of the last century. That seems a long time ago for some reason, when you put it like that. But anyway, 2 were discovered at the very beginning of the last century. 2 were discovered by amateurs. Okay? So to me, that's a little rough. And of course, all of them have very poor documentation. Right? We just have to pretty much believe what they said at the time in order to work with them. So that's a problem for me. So anyway, what happened? I got started at Roc de Marsal. I visited the site in 2002. There's my colleague who works with me at the site, Alain Turc from the museum in Les Aziz. That's my geologist, Paul Goldberg. And we decided to stop by. Alain had really wanted to work on the site because it had never been published before. It had never been published since Lafille worked there. And we talked about it. We decided it might make a good project. We didn't really have in mind anything about the burial. Here's the layout of the site. You basically got these wide areas. Okay, you can see the outline of the cave, right, like this. And the wide areas are the parts that were dug out by Lafille. Here's where he found the Neanderthal. He put this trench in here. This is where he started working. He very nearly cut the site into 4 quarters, which is not a very good way to do archaeology. We knew that the burial was there, but we knew it was taken out. There's nothing left of it. They just removed a whole chunk of the site, right, to excavate the burial in the lab. So we thought, well, we'll just straighten things up, make a nice cut, move the thing back, get some dates, study the industries, and so forth, and call it good. We really didn't think anything about the burial at all. So we started our work first in the back and then moved it out into the front of the cave. And then after a while, things start taking shape. You can see how this is the edge of his trench. And we're just sort of pushing it back, making it nice and straight, and getting some good samples of the material. Here's looking back into the cave and such like that. So that continued at some time. Now, as I said, we didn't really think about the burial, okay, going into the project. We felt that there's just no way we're going to say anything about the burial except maybe be able to date it. But something happened very early on, right here, okay? And right on that spot, we sort of uncovered very quickly, or saw very quickly, a feature, okay? And there it is blown up. Let me do this. This is a blow-up of it. You see, this is all bedrock, okay? Here, let me go back. That one shows it a little bit better. This is all bedrock, all around here. And you guys can see that something has cut out bedrock and filled it, right? So we're thinking, wonder what that is, right? Wonder what that is. Could it be another burial? Could it be something else? Okay. How are we going to dig it? Because we want to do a good job. And one thing I've learned in life, you don't see something interesting like that and immediately tack it with a pick. Okay, you think about it. So we spent about 3 years thinking about it, which may be a little long, but we continued to do other things. Every day we'd walk up and stare at it, you know, and get in arguments about it and so forth. But we really wanted to figure out, okay, how are we going to do it? What are we looking for? How do we, how do we get the right evidence to be able to interpret this thing? So here it is again. That's where we were looking. Meanwhile, we're digging all this stuff down, including taking this little portion down here. Okay? And lo and behold, what we found was, you're sort of looking at the front of the cave, was this trough. Okay? Do you sort of see that? Sort of like a trough. What that is a water channel. Okay? And it's quite clearly water-worn. You can tell from the wear patterns on the rocks that is water that made this. It's in the bedrock of the cave. Okay? So that what you're looking at is all bedrock. Here are the archaeological sediments on top of it. Right? So we're thinking, what? We've got a channel running through here in bedrock? And then, to make things more interesting, those two things line up. We're looking down. Here's the burial. Here's the water-worn trough. It points in this direction, and it goes right into our pit. Okay? So we take another couple of years. We're very thoughtful people. Besides, the food is good in France, so we do a lot of our best thinking over a good meal. So we said, okay, this becomes even more important now, because what that's showing, quite possibly, is that this feature is a natural one, right? That it wasn't a pit cut by Neanderthals into bedrock, that it's a water feature going through the site, okay? So, what does that mean? And will it have implications? Because the implications are this thing could have been a similar kind of channel, right? There's nothing left of it. They took it out when they removed the burial. But seeing if we could make some sort of analogy with what we've got going over here. So that's what I'm going to build up now, is this analogy that we've worked out. What we did, this is going to be hard to explain. We're looking at this as sort of a diagonal anyway. We wanted to get, the thing goes back sort of kitty corner into the side. We wanted to cut a section all the way through it, okay, so we could see it from the side. We're looking at it from the front. And so that's what this is showing. You're looking at the front of the cave. We've removed, starting from here, half of it, pushed back the whole thing, right? Even though you still see the channel feature, this is out front, this is a meter back, okay? You orient it a little bit? So the next slide, I'm going to show you the side of this feature, okay? And there you go. So it's this part here, okay? And you can, so you don't see the bedrock anymore. But one thing we discovered is that the sediments in here are stratified, okay? Now that's very important. That's an important finding in itself, because a pit, let's say you dig a pit or even a natural pit, either one. If you fill it with stuff, it's going to be filled with sort of heterogeneous material, right? It's going to be pit fill, they call it. And it's going to be a jumble of stuff. It's not going to show any clear stratification. What we've got in this, on the other hand, is clear stratification, which suggests that it was filled up gradually and over time, okay? What's more, the layers that we have in this pit look like the same layers we got on the site. Now, this is also difficult to see, but I'll walk you through it. Here's the side of our pit again. And you see you've got sort of dark layers here with an orangish, yellowish layer on top. Follow it over here. Lafille removed all this, so you can't, there's no, connection. Over to here, where you've got dark layers on the bottom capped with an orangish layer. You see that a little bit? Let's move over there and take a closer look. Dark layers capped by an orangish layer. Okay? Now the dark layers are being caused by burning. What they did in the lower levels of the site was they made lots of fireplaces. And not to brag, because I hate to brag, I'm much more proud of my humility, to be truthful. But we've got extraordinary fireplaces at the site. They're dating back to 80 some odd thousand years old. Okay, maybe even 90,000 years old, and they're just amazingly intact. Look at these things, right? That's ash that you're seeing, followed by on top of burned bone, mostly instead of charcoal. Here's a close-up of it. You know, we've still got the ash remnants of these things, and as you know, if you build fires, ashes blow out very quickly. And due to chemical alteration, what happened here is they got a little bit hardened over time, and so they were able to stay. But almost incredibly intact fireplaces. Anyway, it's those hearths that are giving the black sort of, the darkish nature to those sediments. So when we look here, we see the same sorts of things, right? We've got some streaks of darkish kind of levels, just like we have at the other side, which means that basically this stuff, this pit, this natural pit, was in effect empty when Neanderthals first started coming to the site, and then it filled with the same sediments that you get filling the rest of the site. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah? Kind of? Now, what's even more interesting, we don't know, we don't have the burial pit, right? We don't know what the sediments look like. But we do have the one note left by people, and here it is. The skeleton was found in a hole about 70 by 90 and was dug into the lowest level. The body was covered in a blackish sediment. A part of it with yellowish later, covering it, with a part of the skull in there, right? So in other words, that's the only note we got. But what it's saying is probably the stratigraphy of the burial pit was just like this, okay? And you could just imagine, this isn't the burial pit, just imagine the skeleton in here with a little bit of the head poking into that orange layer, okay, is what they're saying here. Now remember, the skeleton you saw in the early pictures was only a meter away, so this is not that big a leap. But it would suggest maybe a couple of things. One, that the pit containing the skeleton was also empty and filled with the sediments during the time of occupation, okay? And that the body was deposited in the later part of this sequence into the yellowish part. Now, it's true, too, that the cave is full of these karstic voids or karstic structures. Okay, here's the one we were working on. It goes back like this. We've mapped out others in the back of the cave, another one here, several over here. Here's where, here's where the burial was. It's gone. We can't say much about it. From what we do know, there's other ones. Here's the burial again, taken away. There's others just toward the rear of the cave, back there, including some bones that we found back there. And so what it looks like to us is increasingly, if we've got a clear, there's no question about it, natural origin to this pit, okay, or it's really a channel or a tube, if you will. It's filled with sediments all the way through. The sediments, as described by Lafille, match the kind of sediments that we see in our pit. Given that there's pits and voids and fissures and everything else throughout the bedrock of the site, my money's that it was there too. Does that make sense to you guys? And that really what we're seeing is a natural fissure with a body in it, okay? And here, let me show you how that works. if you got the bedrock of the cave, long before anybody entered the cave, it's got these natural tubes, probably for drainage, right, that have formed. Over time, you get an erosion of the interior of the cave, exposing some of these things, like this. Kid comes along and later fills up. See what I'm saying? And so for an archaeologist to see that kind of thing, it suggests, you're going to come down, you're going to think you're in a pit. It's got bedrock all around it. It's filled with sediments. I mean, of course it looks like a pit. But he didn't realize, the problem was he didn't realize that that's the nature of the cave. That's the nature of the bedrock of the cave, right? And it's a lot more, if you will, parsimonious explanation than the other. So here's basically, by the way, what the kid would have looked like, in a natural fissure, as I said, arms extended, on his stomach, legs bent, which even when you look at a picture like that, it's like, oh man, is that a burial? Is that a burial? Which is my next question. Oh no, what about grave goods? Yeah, the excavators early on talked about grave goods. We've got several Mousterian flints and animal bones in there, including an intact reindeer long bone and a hyena jaw. Well, that's the same stuff we find all over, right? I'm not gonna write home about that, saying, "Hey, I've got more trash in the pit, the same trash I got everywhere else." No, it gives you nothing. So basically, is Roc de Marsal evidence of deliberate Neanderthal burial? Okay. First of all, no evidence that the pit, even the one containing the burial, was anything but a natural cavity in the bedrock. Right? No special offerings. Just the same kinds of objects that are found everywhere in the site. Again, nothing extraordinary about it. And I suspect that intact preservation of the body really is due to the fact that, yes, it's covered on 3 sides by bedrock. That's going to help preserve the body, right? And it's why, even though it's a child, and the bones are very thin and fragile, they got preserved that way. Doesn't necessarily in itself, that context of the find is what explains the preservation, okay? So that leaves only 3 burials in France. And you know what one I worry about? That one. Because you've got something like 40, 50 kilometers away. Geology's all the same. You've got another site where you have a hole dug in bedrock, right? And I say to myself real quick, I say, that's the biggest, it's the biggest bit of evidence that they used as to why this is a burial, is that hole in bedrock. And now at Roc de Marsal, I see holes in bedrock that have nothing to do with humans, right? It's geological. So if that one goes for the same criteria, we're down to 2. We're down to La Ferricie, discovered in 1909, and Ray Gordeau, the farmer who puts bears in his thing, and lets them go free. So to me, that's a pretty telling thing. So did Neanderthals bury their dead? And of course, remember, I'm speaking mostly about France. Let me tell you something, folks. I'm in print, okay? You don't have to read the whole thing. Just to let you know, some 20 years ago, I wrote that, yes, definite burials do occur, and this is strong evidence, da-da-da-da-da-da. But for me, I'm getting a lot more skeptical about the situation after Roc de Marsal, right? It's one thing to criticize the lack of documentation. You always want more for some of these old finds. It's easy to criticize the fact that they are sometimes amateurs that dug them. But when I get in there and you look at the sort of processes that can fool you, and you study those, that is these geological processes, these natural processes that occur and can lead to situations that can be misinterpreted, right? That's when, I say, okay, now I'm even more, I tend to be a fairly skeptical person anyway, those of you who know me. But this, for me, with burials, I'm ready to say, No, I don't think so. Again, let me just say, it doesn't necessarily, they didn't mean that they didn't have other aspects of behavior that weren't modern. They may well have. But at the same time, I don't think right now that the burial evidence, the evidence of burials, is something that we should put forward and say, yes, this shows, right, modern behavior on the part of Neanderthals. Okay? Good. Thanks very much.
We ought to have a census and see who believes in.
Yeah. This isn't a democracy. This is science.
So what about contemporary burials in North Africa then, where you've been working? Are there any?
The people, we have modern humans there.
Right.
Some are more claimed to be burials than others, but no, the claim for burial isn't as strong there in the Middle Paleolithic with modern Homo sapiens. But the claim for burials isn't there yet.
And when do you think burial, in the light of your revelation this summer, when do you think burial does come in?
Well, you know, I leave aside, and I'm expecting somebody here to attack me on this, I left aside the evidence from Israel especially that has a lot of important Neanderthal finds and a lot of sites where it's much more difficult to dispute burials. Those things go back to easily 110,000. So probably at that time anyway, right? The question is, are those just sort of pure Neanderthals, or is that moderns bringing that custom in, if you will? I think the question, and I'm running into this question right now already, is we've got a body, we've got a natural pit, we've got a body in it. The question that follows is, okay, the pit's natural, but did they lovingly put the body into this natural pit, right? That's possible too. Or conversely, just like you say, the kid falls in, cracks his skull, any number of things, right? And they didn't do anything about it. So we've got a body in a hole. The hole's natural. We could probably argue about how deliberate was the body, how did the body find its way in there till the cows come home, right? And I don't know that we'll ever be able to resolve that. But people will argue about it. But you're absolutely right. Sure, it could be. To me, it could be any number of things. Yeah, to me, that's no way to bury somebody. I can't use that argument because people have weird customs. Look at the Brits. You ever tried their cooking? But that's the problem. To me, though, it strikes me as strange. The other thing that strikes me as strange is why bury a 2 or 3 year old kid? These are hunter-gatherers. Most hunter-gatherer groups do not really relish having children anyway, and they certainly don't put them on par with adults, right? And so it's like now you've got a kid being treated like an adult in hunter-gatherer times. It strikes me as weird. So there's a couple of little fuzzy things. Maybe in Neanderthal times they thought highly of kids. I know after having 2, I would never make that mistake, but with determination. It is also true, you asked a very good question, and I didn't really point out in here, the bedrock at that site is extremely friable, okay? And so it does come apart very quickly in chunks, right? And you can take it out. I don't know what the situation is at La Chapelle-aux-Saints, and I haven't gotten there to check it out yet. Okay? It's so funny with Neanderthals, the same paper that I cited 20 years ago, we did a big review of Middle Paleolithic symbolic evidence. And there are so many loony things out there that are put forward as being evidence for symbolism. It's ridiculous. So it really boils down to what does it take to be a recognizable symbol, right? What does it take in an artifact? And that's a very difficult question to answer. So I would say that there's a lot of equivocal things that if you close one eye and cross another, okay, maybe that's symbolic. There's virtually nothing that would convince a skeptic. And I'm not even putting myself there. If you really wanted to be skeptical, there's nothing out there that's going to convince you. You walk into a painted cave, you walk into the Valley of the Kings. I don't care how skeptical you are. you're going to say, looks like something ritual was going on here, right? You would have to be blind not to see that. And even by the Upper Paleolithic, the burials that we have are really amazing. I'm really mad at myself I didn't put a slide up as a comparison. But oftentimes, not all times, but oftentimes, I mean, you're covered with literally thousands of beads, right? And ochre, right? And things that could be at least accepted by people as being offerings. Right? We don't know that they were, but okay, it's a reasonable argument. But you don't get those in Neanderthals. And in fact, you don't get those kinds of things in Neanderthal sites, right? And that's one of the big issues. And it's going to remain a controversy for some time. This is a hot subject, right? This is not one that's going to be resolved anytime soon. Well, the thing is, you know, I took what your first part of your question as being the difference between a burial and a funeral. Okay, you're saying grave there, okay? And yes, that to me is a very important distinction. Things get buried, things get covered for all sorts of reasons, right? What we need to do, this is an important question. I think that when symboling started, and just as Richard asked, you know, okay, how far back does this go? We want to know the answer to that question, right? That's a good question. Well, we got to be careful about our evidence then, right? We have to be skeptical about it. We can't just take anything and say, look, this could be. Could it be? Sure, it could be. But how firm is the evidence really, right? And it isn't, when we're trying to find the earliest whatevers, you do have to be critical. You have to really have the evidence there. If you find an early tablet that's in a stratum way too early than any of it has been found before, you could do one of two things. You could pull that thing up and say, I've got the earliest tablet in the world, or check to see if there isn't somehow it fell down a shaft or something, right? And maybe that explains why it's so low. Be careful about your evidence, right? And with a field as emotional sometimes, as paleoanthropology in general, but I think Neanderthals in particular, people get very emotional about the subject. There's a lot, to me, there's a lot of wishful thinking there, right? Of saying, oh, come on. And then people have asked me this, you know, how come you don't like Neanderthals? I've never met one. I like them just fine. But what I want to do is I want to understand what they were like. I don't want, I'll tell you what I don't want to do. I don't want to take Neanderthals and say, okay, Neanderthals, I'm going to do you a big favor, and I'm going to call you just like us. Where's the big favor of that, right? I mean, they lived from 250,000 years ago to about 30,000 years ago. Have we lived that long? No. Do you look around the world and say, oh, what a peaceful people modern Homo sapiens are, and they're at one with nature, you know? No. When you try to, just for wishful thinking, you try to make Neanderthals into humans, that is, modern humans. To me, that's as big an insult as you can get. Why not try to understand what they were really doing? They will undoubtedly have many aspects of us. The more we understand about chimps, gorillas, and so forth, it's astounding how much they are like us, right? I'll bet Neanderthals were too. They were big brains as big as ours. They had all sorts of technological sophistication. But the thing that I wonder about is the nature of their adaptation different from what we see in the globe today? And if so, it would sure be fascinating to try to reconstruct that. And instead of just trying to pigeonhole it, right, into one thing, pigeonhole into dumb Neanderthal, smart Neanderthal. No, let's not go there. What about middle Neanderthal, right? And see what, or different Neanderthal, and see what they're doing. Yeah, there's clear evidence of a lot of fires, and I wasn't emphasizing that in the talk, but in the lower levels, we've got some levels, very thin like this, that are very black. And when we dig down to them, what it is several actual discrete hearths or campfires. Look at them as campfires. And what happens is, while a lot of them are very intact, sometimes, of course, the charcoal, the ash gets distributed, thus turning the entire level black. We don't see, so back up, in some cases we see evidence that the fire was built right there. We've got the reddened soil underneath, the charcoal or burnt bone, and then the ash on top, which is your typical sort of strata for a fire. In the pit, we only get the blackened stains, meaning that things are either pushed or trampled or blown in there, okay? What we don't see is the entire level on fire, if that's what you're getting at. No, I don't see any actual burning in the back pit. That's what I was trying to say, is that's occurring out front. We get the burnt sort of ash layers in the back, but I think it's trampling or wind blowing or something like that. If there's lots of fires around, what it tends to do is it colors the whole layer for a little bit of time. But no, we don't see any evidence of them building fires in the back. Yeah, that's a good question. One of my colleagues, Shannon McFerrin, works with Max Planck. He says, if you want to find a Neanderthal fossil, go to where there's some already found, because they tend to occur together, right? And it's one of the interesting things about La Ferricie, the one that, it has several individuals, right? 6 in total. And that's a lot harder to dismiss, right, when you get that many. It's the isolated ones, like you just say, that are a little problematic. Of course, on the other hand, remember, these were very mobile people, right? These caves and rock shelters, they didn't stay there for months or years at a time. They would stop, do some things, move on. Stop, do some things, move on. So it's really a question of when Uncle Charlie died, right? And that's where they'd put them. Or so it seems. Okay. We don't see any true cemeteries, though. Okay. We'll see sites that have a few hominid remains, but there doesn't seem to be anything that really reflects a true cemetery. It's a real problem. I mean, people have been talking. There's more pages written on Neanderthal language than you shake a stick at, and the evidence biologically is equivocal. Biologically, more people come down against it being full-blown language, but it's very difficult to reconstruct because the whole pharynx is pretty much soft tissue, and the only bony element in there is the hyoid, and its position is very important, and you don't know where it was when you found it. So there's also the bottom of the skull has a certain what's called a flexion to it that seems to be related to the muscle attachment for the pharynx and so forth. So people look at that. But it's impossible to really reconstruct what the voice box was at any time. So again, turning to the archaeological evidence, which a lot of people have done, looking for anything, because you're right, language is symbolic. If you have language, you have symbols. If you have symbols, probably you have language, right? It was pen anthropology, for those of you who didn't know that, in the 70s that defined culture and language as being the same thing, right? And they're both highly symbolic. So it's virtually anything we can look for. And people have used the patterning and stone tools to try to see if they could represent words, right, or something. That didn't work at all. They've tried all sorts of things to try to get at this question, but so far without any clear success, right? It's still a hotly debated topic. Well, with Shanidar, which is a site up in the Zagros region, and made very famous, a guy named Selecki dug it back in the 50s for his graduate research, actually. And they had a lot of individuals, which they interpreted as burials. They also, the thing that really extraordinary, you always call something extraordinary, is they had evidence of flowers deposited in the burial. And they were incredibly, incredibly well-preserved flowers. They had the stamens intact, right, and surrounding the bodies. You could identify all the plants without any problem. And so Selecki is back in the 60s when he wrote the book, The First Flower Children. Remember the flower children? You guys went through that phase yourselves, I'll bet, right? And so it was really big, and this was a very important thing. Nobody mentioned the fact until it finally started coming out in the 80s that the workmen used to come to work at the site, the Kurdish workmen, would come to the site every day, and on their way into the site, pick up flowers and put them in the belts, right? It was just something they did. Then they'd go into the site and work. And so the problem, given two things, One, the state of preservation of the flowers, which was extraordinary, suggests that it's recent. Given that the plant composition was exactly the same as outside the cave today, suggests it's a sampling of stuff coming in. In fact, one of the papers written at the time was how some of the plants brought in by the Neanderthals, assuming it was Neanderthals, represented the same plants used today for medicinal purposes and stuff like that occur right outside. So to me, it's too much of a coincidence, right? That if people are bringing these plants in, you've got fantastic preservation of them, then I'm sorry, it's hard to believe. I'll remain skeptical, I'll put it that way.
Well, thank you, Harold. Thank you very much.
So thank all of you.